Hi, I'm Laurie Blakeman. I'm the MLA for the fabulous constituency of Edmonton Centre, and I'm running for the leadership for the ALP. And I've been asked by a number of different educational groups what my take is on education in the province of Alberta. So I'd like to talk about that today. First of all, I'd like to give you 4 set the context observations about me and education. The first is education has not been one of the 11 portfolios I've been critic for, so I'm not an expert on that, and I'll say it up front. Secondly, education is consistently one of the top 5 issues that's identified by my constituents as a priority for them. Third, I'm the child of 2 educators. My mother was a K-6 teacher and principal. My father was a high school administrator and vocational trades teacher. And they both spent their careers doing that. And lastly, I see education as an investment in the sense that I wouldn't necessarily include education on the operational side of funding as an expense. I see it more along the capital column, in that it's an investment and you end up with an asset. The asset you end up with at the end of it is an educated citizenry, someone who contributes to society and by living, by working, by raising a family. So those are the ways that, that's the lens that I view education through. I'd like to spend some time specifically addressing questions that I've been asked about education and what's being proposed currently by the Minister of Education. One of the questions I've been asked is, what is my vision for fine arts education in Alberta? And again, I refer back to my parents. My mother was a visual artist, and I grew up in a house filled with art. We were taken to events. We had toys that encouraged creative thought and creative solutions. She hated colored pencils because they didn't work the same way as a pastel or as chalk, for example, where you could blend it. She hated things that were outlined already, like coloring books, because you had to color inside of the lines. You didn't invent the thing yourself. And that is the way I approach fine art. I think it should permeate our system. It should be readily available, not only as separate options to develop a particular skill or experience level, but also as teaching tools in many different disciplines, in math, in science, in the social sciences, for example. So I think it's part of how we learn, not a specific option that you go to from 2 to 3 o'clock every Wednesday. And that's answered a bit of the second question as well, because I do see art and arts education is being embedded into the system with a particular emphasis on creativity when you're younger, and as you get older on critical thinking and working toward a knowledge-based economy, innovative thinking, if you want to put it that way. The Minister of Education has recently tabled his Education Act, which is to be considered by all of us. And along with that comes a document called Inspiring Action on Education. And I've reviewed the document. The question is, do I support it? The answer is, of course, we would all support what the document is outlining, that it's a more flexible system, that it's student-focused, that it inspires education, that it concentrates on learners. It has many worthy ideas. The problem is always how they end up getting implemented in the long run. So this is a government, the Conservative government, believes in smaller government, in less government. So the decisions on how they will implement that idea, that agenda will always come down to less government involvement. So we would see more downloading onto school boards and onto communities and onto families as a result of that. That may not be what we think of when we read that document, because it seems to read as a collaborative document. But the implementation of it is what becomes important. So on the face of it, I do support what is in the Inspiring Action on Education document, but how the government actually chooses to implement it would be different from how I would choose to implement it. There's a question about government funding, and do I think the amount of money that the government provides now for education is adequate? And I say no, on a couple of levels. To me, one of the indicators is, do parents have to do fundraising in order to have a complete education for their children? And I think the answer is yes. In every school, they're charging school fees. There's additional fundraising done by parents or by teachers to augment the educational experience that kids are getting. That means to me that the government is not spending enough on education. And I do see education as an investment, and you end up with an asset, so it's worth the investment. The second part about funding is we need to keep in mind that there were massive cuts to the education in the 1990s. So when you hear figures about, oh, we've increased our spending by huge percentages, they're usually going from the bottom of the cuts to where we are today. And that is a giant leap, but going from where we were before the cuts to where we are today, which is now a period of some 20 years, actually the change in investment in education is not that high. One of the questions that always goes along with this is, how do we fund education, or how do we find new funding for education? And I want to take a step back and take a much larger look at how do we fund government, period. So one of the things that I would be doing as a leader of the ALP, or as leader of the province, is to assemble a citizens' assembly, individuals from each of the ridings in the province who would go through a process to get educated and then debate and consider how we could fund government revenue, period. In other words, considering things like getting rid of corporate and personal income tax altogether, and looking at perhaps a consumption tax, or how we balance our natural resource revenue, whether that would go completely into a savings plan or whether we would put some of it directly into certain areas. So I would like to see the whole concept of how government is funded to provide us with programs and services looked at by a citizens' assembly. There's a question being asked of me of how long do I think implementing a new Education Act or a new scheme for education should take. And I think any reasonable manager will tell you that you're looking for a short, medium, and a long-term benchmark on it. So I would be looking at a 1 year, a 3 year, a 5 and a 10. And at that point you have targets that you would design to accomplish, and also a point where you could review what you had done to that point and know whether what you were doing was useful and whether it was changing it in as meaningful a way as you had intended. The final question in this series is, how do I see fine arts education, or how important do I think it is to the school system? And as I said, my life is filled with art. It has enhanced me enormously. It's made me a better critical thinker. It's made me more creative. It allows me to think outside of the box more often. And here's a brief question, or a brief example of things. I was trained as a little ballerina, which is a very rigid process, and you have to do things exactly a certain way. But in my drama classes, I worked with a young man who in fact was a director and had to take a dance class as part of the overall Bachelor of Fine Arts program. And he had nothing to do with dance, but was asked to create a dance with a household item or a usual item in his life. And because he wasn't trained in a very narrow way, he just dealt with the question and was far more creative in the dance that he came up with a motorcycle tire and a chain than what I did as the perfectly trained little ballerina. He was far more creative because he was already outside of the box, or rather he hadn't been trained into a box. So to me, that's the epitome of what we can do with our education system by being flexible, by being responsive, by funding it adequately, and by allowing students to move through with as many different resources available to them as possible. Thanks very much.